How's it going, everybody? This podcast is brought to you by Rise Make Life Workout, a health, self-development and lifestyle platform building a passionate community of knowledge seekers, creative dreamers and future leaders.
For details on the latest Rise event that will feature expert speakers in the field of self-development and growth, check out www.rise-workout.com.
That's www.rise-workout.com. Enjoy the show.
Kia ora tātou, welcome back to Rise Optimize, where we make science simple to help you optimize your health. I'm Dr Char and I'm here with Shenae.
Hi team.
And today we're going to talk about how is technique important for your training?
Correct. I'm excited about this topic. It's a topic I'm very passionate about and often see a bit of misinformation out there about technique and its importance. So it'll be good to, I guess, offer some different situations and scenarios as to when it is important and when it's maybe not as important as we think it is.
Yeah, you see a lot of reels on Instagram, sort of, in my opinion, perhaps overcomplicating things somewhat, or overemphasizing, all the micro parts of a movement and how important it is to do this, that, and the other thing. And it's all a lot to kind of take in if you're new to exercise or you're just trying to get into stuff. So
Definitely.
I think a chat about this will be quite interesting. So to kick us off, what do we mean by technique?
Well, I guess technique is the form one takes when they are executing a movement. So it's how your body is moving throughout the movement, but also how you're setting up that movement in order to move well, hopefully, in that movement.
Yeah, and moving well is sort of context dependent, really, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah. What's optimal or correct, I guess, is going to be different depending on someone's goals when it comes to performing that movement.
Yeah, so can we talk about some of these terms that people often associate with technique, things like optimal versus correct versus efficient? A lot of those are usually used sort of interchangeably, but I feel like there's a difference between them and they probably mean different things. What would you say each of those are?
Definitely. I think efficient is something that, yes, generally that should be an aim, and that is the main reason when technique is important, is when we're wanting to move efficiently. So usually that's going to come down to physics and our biomechanics as to how we can do a movement the most efficiently to either maximize our speed or maximize our endurance or maximize the amount of weight we're lifting.
With the smallest input of energy that you can. Yeah.
And whereas correct per se, and correct I think can be a bit more subjective.
Oh, interesting. Because I was sort of thinking of correct as being something that you might compare to like a really sort of rigid biomechanical model of like, this is...
Well, that's in that, yes, it comes down to, I guess, that sort of objective checklist of what a correct movement should be. But I guess it would be subjective to whoever's saying that's correct or that's not correct. It comes down to their interpretation, I guess, of what a correct movement is.
Yeah. I almost feel like a binary classification is it's not wide enough to address the variability in our anatomy and our movement patterns across the population. To say something is correct or incorrect is sort of...
I even saw an influencer the other day who had posted 3 videos of his deadlift, and he said which one is optimal, the left, middle or right, and they were all slightly different, and he had done a poll on his Instagram asking what people thought, and obviously there was a percentage for each one, and then there was also the option of all of the above, and that's when I thought, well, yeah, it somewhat depends on the context or what you're trying to get out of that movement as to what would be most optimal. I thought most efficient, yes, it was the one on the left where he had, I guess, quote unquote great technique, whereas the other one, he was lifting more from his hips when he was coming up in his deadlift, and the last one, the bar was further away from his body. But yeah, I still thought it still kind of depends on your goal.
Yeah, so there will be overlap often between what might be optimal and what's efficient. But say you're doing some sort of movement like where you're emphasizing the eccentric phase of a movement and it's slower because you're trying to put those muscles under load for longer. that wouldn't be optimal for necessarily completing, like say it's a squat or something. Optimal for completing a squat quickly, or even necessarily, quickly or efficiently. It wouldn't be efficient to do as the most efficient way to do that, but it might be optimal for the type of training that you're trying to do at that point in time and the goal that you're trying to achieve. So I reckon those two terms probably overlap, but sometimes they don't. And optimal is probably more goal dependent, whereas efficient's quite smallest input for greatest output.
Yeah, definitely. So it's definitely an important sort of clarification to make before we get into when technique is not so important.
And correct is sort of something that I imagine you probably grinds your gears a little bit when you see stuff on Instagram and it's like, this is wrong, that's right.
The green tick and the red arrow of being like, don't do this, you'll break your back, don't do this.
This is
how you hurt your shoulder or whatever. When it's, again, I just look at those videos and I just think, oh, well, again, there's just so many factors that come into play. It's not just, how someone's technique or form is in regards to if they're going to injure themselves or have discomfort, but we can touch on that later. We should start off with just when technique is important, which we've sort of touched on a little bit, and it is when the goal is efficiency. So when we have a movement that is goal focused or performance driven, in that we're wanting to complete a particular movement as efficiently as we can to improve our performance parameters. So whether that is to, like I said, as quick as we can, as fast as we can, the heaviest thing we can. In order to do that, we need to be doing that movement as efficiently as we can. So generally speaking, if the exercise you're completing is purposeful, your technique should reflect that. And I would think for a lot of people, even if you are probably doing exercise willy-nilly, like you might not have some big competition or goal, but if you're still wanting to sort of improve your fitness and get better at what you're doing, your technique should still be efficient. Should still be something that you focus on, but not, I think, to the nth degree that is sometimes shown on social media.
Yes. Those reels that have been going around at the moment of what it would be like if you did your everyday activities like you do at the gym sort of remind me of that, and it's someone like loading the laundry perfectly or
doing a squat to pick up a washing glass or something. They're great. So I guess we can touch on some examples as well, examples of that efficiency of movement, and you can obviously chime in on your experience as well with this, but I feel a good one in regards to weightlifting would be like a clean and jerk that they do in CrossFit, and or the clean and press that we do in a body pump class. It's a movement that commonly I see with new people, they will struggle to get the idea of having the bar close to your body, leading with your elbows, and that as you get to that part on your chest, that's when you want to quickly flick the elbows underneath the bar. Often you see people swing the bar away from their body to bring it under their chin, and not efficient, but is it, I guess, problematic, and that is that person more likely to injure themselves? Often I think when they're starting out and it's quite lightweight, it's unlikely they'll hurt themselves doing that. But in order for them to progress that movement and that exercise and to lift more down the track, you want to get that efficient technique. Ideally, the earlier the better, because obviously the more repetitions we're doing in a less ideal technique, it's going to be harder to get the hang of it down the track. More taxing as well, obviously, because of that efficiency thing where you're having to put in more input to achieve a certain output, which could be achieved with a lot less input. So if you're doing many repetitions of it, it'll be more taxing and harder for you to move up in weight. So looking at technique as a way of seeing improvements as well, and motor learning is a big place that you get gains in your efficiency and fitness in a way, really, because you're sort of moving loads more efficiently. And as well with what muscle groups you're targeting. Obviously when you're swinging away from your body, that's going to be a lot more load and work through your forearms and your shoulders and smaller muscle groups. When we keep it close to our body, we're able to use a bit more momentum from our lower body and back, and bigger muscle groups that they're going to be able to, again, move that bar a lot quicker and easier than the smaller muscle groups. So, I mean, something like the clean and press and body pump, I feel like the way that they've designed body pump, they took into account that not everyone's technique is always going to be perfect when they're doing movements like that, and kind of constrained the amount of load in a way. Because what's the most that you could put on a body pump bar? Like 60 kgs? If you really wanted to. Say, the most you usually see, particularly for something like that clean and press track, would be max 20 kilos, which is the equivalent of Olympic bar. So that's where there's times where I have seen people that I think, oh God, like they don't have the greatest technique, but especially if it's someone that's been coming to pump for years, then I think, well, he's probably been cleaning the bar like that for the last 5 or 10 years. His body's probably adapted to him doing it that way, and if he's not in any pain or having any issues whilst doing it that way, then I'm like, oh well. And especially if there's someone that's just, no matter how many cues you give them, you try and make eye contact, they're just sort of like a zombie staring straight through you. Those are the people that I feel I could light myself on fire on the stage and they still wouldn't notice me. So I kind of am like, oh, I give up. Unless they, again, said that they were having issues or pain, then I'd be like, okay, look, let's try something different. But yeah, what are some other examples? Running is another one that I've listed down, which I think running out of a lot of sports is probably the most variance when it comes to technique. And I think if you spoke to 10 different runners, they would all tell you something different in regards to what's the most efficient running technique. I think the literature has got a little bit more. So back in the day, they used to always be like, heel striking is bad. You should all aim to be a midfoot runner or a forefoot runner. I think the literature is more clear on that. Regardless of what type of foot strike you have, you kind of want your foot to be striking directly underneath your knee, and obviously a slightly flexed knee when you're running. That's kind of more a key thing to be looking at versus how someone's striking. Stride length and cadence are also factors, but again, that would come into whether you're obviously a sprinter versus middle distance or long distance. And arm swing as well. Generally, the shorter arm swing you have, the better. But again, there are some elite Olympic athletes out there that have crazy amount of crossbody arm swing, and they're fast because it's usually, the arm swing is obviously you're sort of counterbalancing. So if you've got obviously a lot of motion and rotation happening up there, it's usually because you're countering some movement down there. There's also a type of sport where often when you try and correct those, what some may see as a fault in their technique.
Or inefficient.
Or inefficient,
basically.
yeah.
It's inefficient sort of technically, but somehow it's optimal for their anatomy.
Yes.
So when you then introduce a change, it ends up resulting in some sort of flow-on effect, or it can do.
Correct, yeah. And I sort of shared that example with you before of a friend of mine that has always had quite pronated feet, or her feet roll in, and has always been a runner, and got new shoes one day and they'd said, oh look, your feet really roll in, you should be wearing shoes with more arch support and orthotics. And she got given them, and her first few runs it was knee pain, calf pain, all these different issues, and she was like, what the hell, I've never had these issues before when I ran. So went back to flat shoes and was all good. So yeah, runners are one that definitely there's going to be variance, and there's I think more than one efficient technique when it comes to running.
Yeah, or there's just different optimal techniques for or the most efficient thing is very subject dependent.
Yes.
Yeah, because there's a lot of different factors there. And I mean, even just doing things on ergometers or things like cycling or rowing, it'll be kind of similar. There'll be what is technically might be the most efficient way of doing it, but to suit different people's anatomy and the way that they move and their motor patterns, something that's optimal for them might look very different than someone else. Yeah, we were talking about runners before that sort of famously inefficient. Paula Radcliffe is one. She's from Great Britain, and she runs with basically her shoulders up at her earlobes. It looks so uncomfortable, but she would win and break records. So it's like not the most efficient to hold that much tension up here. But it was optimal for her, and as far as I know, didn't result in any extra injury for her. As well, because that's another part of technique that's sort of often talked about, is the terrible things that can happen when your technique fails. So maybe we can talk about that sort of context, because I do think there's some value of having an awareness of what efficient technique is, or what biomechanically is perhaps a more safe technique that loads your joints and things in a way that isn't crazy. It's quite good to have an awareness, like an intellectual awareness of that, but also a body awareness of that, so that when you start to feel yourself fail, or you can recognize that, then you can call whether you want to load more and more. Yeah, so maybe we can talk about that. And especially you would have seen lots of injuries where people have probably overloaded it and maybe blamed their technique failure
Yeah.
And whether or not that's the right sort of mentality to have around it.
Yeah, no, definitely that sort of does lead in where, again, it's not where technique is not important, but it's more that when you are pushing to your max and or reaching that point of fatigue, your technique will likely start to falter or not be as perfect as it was when you were warming up or doing sets at a lighter repetition. And so, like you said, in regards to having that awareness of when your technique is starting to go, it's being aware of that to know that, okay, I'm sort of pushing towards my max. You might think your max is up near 100 for your deadlift, but you're getting to 80 kilos and you're like, oh fuck, I can already feel that I'm struggling to maintain my perfect technique. It might be that you don't then that day decide to push on to try and go for 100 when you're already feeling your technique sort of start to slip, because it could be so many other factors that have led to that. How you slept the night before, what you've had on that day, other stresses in your life that are meaning your technique is starting to falter. So because if you were to push on, then you're probably at a slightly higher risk of injuring yourself.
Where you're sort of getting to that point where you're loading your joints or the tissues to the point that they can't they can't stand it and they'll fail.
Yeah, definitely. So
which you don't want, but it's helpful to have someone, if you're not sure of what an appropriate technique is for a movement, to have someone either show you what that is and practice it.
Yeah, definitely. When if someone's new and they're learning different movements, I think it is definitely good to get some advice on what good technique would be for that particular movement. And it's just to have that awareness as you progress that movement and want to try and maybe push a bit more with weight or with load, that you're then aware of like, oh, I think I'm getting to my limit. That might be it for today. Next week I can try again type thing, versus if you're already, and so often I would say honestly 9 times out of 10 people that strain their back when doing a deadlift or a squat, 9 times out of 10 they say my back already felt tight that day. Their back either felt tight when they woke up that morning, they felt a bit tight during the day, they were doing their warm-up sets and they felt a bit iffy, but still kept pushing through, and then again got to 50 kilos when they'd normally be fine, starting to feel something, but still like, no, I'm planning on doing 5 sets of 80 today or whatever, and then that's when tweak. So that's where listening to your body is always key. And
you sort of accumulate that experience as you engage in the activity more, of knowing when to push through, and that body awareness of when you might be losing form to a point where it becomes a bit more risky. One thing that I noticed I've been doing a bit of Olympic weightlifting and trying to improve my technique for it actually, so I can be more efficient. And the coach that I see really drills in lots of repetitions at light loads with the right sort of form, or efficient form, because when you add weight you need to be ready to kind of kick everything into gear to accommodate it. So I've never found it so hard to do, like snatches with just a bar, because he's just drilling you the whole, like holding positions for quite a long time, and just really over exaggerating the drive overhead and things like that.
A snatch is such a challenging movement that I think that is one where technique, you've got to kind of nail that in order to lift anyway. I think I'm the same. I think there was times where I used to just be able to nail it with the bar, and I think I'm ready to add weight, and then as soon as I would, I'd be like, oh shit, I'm not as good as I thought I was, and it would be back to the bar and just again rep after rep of just nailing that technique, getting the hip drive, getting the drop and the drive, like getting all of that perfect. Not perfect, but like you said, getting that motor learning and getting everything happening, so it's automatic, so that as you're upping the weight that's still happening, that you don't go back to trying to pull the bar and things like that, because again, once you've got more load, you're not going to be able to pull the bar. That you do require your body to help get under the bar. One thing I really have a lot of respect for good coaches, because it's very difficult to teach complex movements well, because the way that we learn, or like when you're doing a movement, you are aware of the intention to do it, but there's a lot of things that happen automatically, and so to tweak a little element of your technique and have someone give you the right kind of cue or feedback on what you need to do to transform that into the new part of the movement that you need to add in or exaggerate or whatever, that's a real skill. Because I've often seen people kind of over-explain every single part of like an Olympic lift, and it's cognitively very exhausting for the person who's then trying to transform that into a movement that looks anything, that correct this and correct that, and then once you get to here, over-exaggerate this. Our nervous system, it does a lot of things in parallel. It doesn't do things sequentially like that, so it's quite difficult to if you overwhelm people with too many
cues to actually end up with change in a person's technique if you're trying to optimize it or make it more efficient in some way. So I don't have any experience coaching or anything like that, but I have a lot of respect for people who are very good at it.
I was going to say the same, particularly in weightlifting. I think there's times where a movement will feel off, and sometimes there will be multiple things that were kind of off with that, but for a coach to be able to be like, you just need to focus on this and give you one thing to focus on, that is obviously going to have the biggest impact in that movement being more efficient for you, and then down the track and say, oh, also these little things. But I have always found that amazing when you've got coaches that are just like, this thing for now, just focus on that one thing and get that nailed, and then focus on XYZ.
I'm just always amazed by the skill set to have that level of understanding of like movement and what's the most efficient, which is sort of more of a science, but then transforming that into an outcome where you're interacting with a person who might have like a different preference for how they want to be communicated with and how they actually move, all of that kind of stuff.
To make that cue land, I think as well, to be able to say it in a way that person's like, I get it.
I got it.
You could say something like, oh, you need to externally rotate your shoulder more. Like, what the fuck does that mean to a lot of people? To be able to say, like, imagine you've got an orange under your armpit and you're trying to squeeze it as you twist or whatever. They use analogies that you're like, oh, that makes a lot of sense versus the technical way of saying it.
Okay, so going back to when technique starts to fail, which is often under heavy loads, high volume and fatigue is present, you'll see deviations in form from what you would see at lighter loads, and your body starts to compensate in different ways. When is that dangerous? Is it not dangerous? There's sort of a bit of fear around that.
That is a great question, because I think commonly when we do see those deviations from someone's norm, that people just assume that that's going to be problematic or that they're at risk of an injury. And I think a great example of that is knee caving when someone's squatting. Generally that's something that's seen as bad. And I think the reason that's been always seen as bad is linked to the literature on ACL injuries, because commonly it's always been thought that ACL injuries, the mechanism of injury is from knee valgus or your knee going inwards. But first of all, you've got to understand that they are obviously two very different contexts in regards to running or some sort of sporting injury where you are usually single leg or unilateral, you're moving, it's more dynamic, versus a squat where you're on two legs, it's a lot more stable. So already they're just quite different contexts that you can't really compare. So when it comes to squatting and the knees coming in, often you only see that in quite elite lifters when they're lifting quite heavy loads. Like if you watch a lot of videos of elite weightlifters squatting heavy, you'll see in their warm-up sets they don't have it, and it's just as they're getting to their max that sort of like that little buckle in of their knees as they're pushing back out. And so it's actually quite a beneficial or advantageous strategy for them, because what it's doing is allowing the legs to use other muscle groups. So when the knees are dropping in, usually their internal rotators and adductors are helping to internally rotate or turn the leg inwards and pronate the foot to generate more force from the ground as
to get you sort of through that sticking point.
To drive yourself up under that heavy load. So that's why for them it can be quite a beneficial thing. And I'm sure that can still happen, because obviously everyone's max is going to be different. So that is still why it would be common to see that with a new person maybe learning to squat. If they've gone from just doing body weighted squats to then trying to squat with a barbell, that they might get that little buckle because they might already be hitting their max, and it's their body being like, oh, I've got to try and stand up, and it's therefore recruiting extra muscle to try and generate more force to push out. So that's one example of where the change in technique isn't necessarily
so you're saying if that isn't present at lighter loads or submaximal loads, and then it's present in maximal loads, it's not problematic. What happens if it's present at submaximal loads?
Again, for me it always just comes back to like, is that person having issues or pain? Like if it's a new person doing a body pump class and their knees were kind of dropping in a little bit, to me it would just be checking like, do you have any knee discomfort or any issues with it? If not, I would be like, cool. But if that was limiting someone from being able to lift heavier, then maybe it might be worth addressing. But again, it would come down a bit to people's anatomy. It's the same how everyone's squat is going to look different depending on like your limb length, like how long your femurs are,
how deep your hip sockets are.
So that's another one I was going to touch on, is like the butt wink, which is obviously
I was going to ask about that.
Another viral reel, which is like, fix your butt wink, bow, bow, bow. So for those that might not be familiar with a butt wink, it is basically when your lower back flexes slightly and your pelvis posterior tilts, so tucks under. So it's usually seen at the bottom of a squat when someone goes down that they've got that rounding of the lower back. And again, it's labelled as incorrect and dysfunctional and blah, 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 needs to be fixed. And often for people, it can be sort of, if they've got limited hip range, it means that their lower back's going to try and compensate a bit more. So for some people, simply shifting their width wider will help to open their hips a bit more, and therefore
elevating your heels.
Elevating heels, or even just bringing the load more anteriorly, because then that's going to force you to have to keep your torso more upright and change your center of mass, which will also reduce the need for your lower back to help out. But in saying that, it makes out that like neutral spine is this magical place where there's no injuries or issues. But even when people are cued to maintain a neutral spine or to keep neutral spine through different exercises, there's been a few studies that have found that even when we do that, on average, 22 to 27 degrees of lumbar flexion still occur in movements.
That's a big old range there.
So like from a kettlebell swing, a good morning, or a deadlift. So they're movements where you're cued to keep a perfect straight flat back, keep a neutral spine. And yet those movements, even when people are cued that, and from a picture, like they're doing a perfect deadlift with a flat back, they're still going to have a small, around 20 to 30 degrees of flexion happening, because it's, for a lot of people, it's just almost impossible to maintain that perfect neutral spine. And again, it's not really an issue. It's more important about like how much, how often, how intense that spinal flexion is occurring versus if it's occurring at all.
What about the old spinal flexion in deadlift? Like you're having a rounded, when your thoracic spine kind of rounds over.
Yeah, again, I'd say it's more common to see that when someone is pushing their max. Like you see, crazy power lifters when they're trying to lift like 300 plus kilos.
Yeah, some of them also lift it like in spinal flexion the whole way as well.
The whole way. It's not till they get right to the top that they kind of like be able to pull themselves back.
Yeah.
So that's where I think, and again, those kind of people, it's not like they went from 0 kilos to 300 kilos overnight. Like they've obviously built that weight up over time. Their body's become accustomed to that kind of load and lifting that kind of load in that position. So that's where I think not so much of an issue. Whereas again, someone that might not be lifting regularly and then they bend forward to try and like lift their couch and hurt their back, that's going to be more because you're not used to lifting that kind of load regularly, and you've just tried to lift your heavy couch and hurt yourself. So yeah, more about how much and how often and how intense versus if it's happening.
Right.
Which is why, again, a lot of the research in regards to the back and lifting and things like that, a lot of the research is on sort of occupational health and safety and manual handling training. And you would think if the advice of lifting with a straight, stiff, neutral back was king, then we wouldn't see as many lifting injuries in the workplace. But even with that advice and workplaces that get all that training, there still is just as many injuries. And they even did a study comparing lifting a box, either a squat, so being told to keep your back flat and bend with your knees and lift a box. Freestyle, lift it however way you want to, or lifting it stooped, so your legs have to stay straight and you have to bend forward with your back. And they actually found that the stoop lifting produced lower compression and shear forces in the back than anything else, because often that's a reason that people say flexion's bad when you're lifting, because they're like, oh, you're going to increase the compression and shear forces in the back and the tissues and that's going to cause an injury, blah blah blah, when in that situation stooped lifting was actually less of that.
Yeah, in terms of the stress that's placed on the tissues and on your body. One thing I find, I don't know the studies that you looked at, but often it's so focused on just the lift. Yeah. Like it sort of ignores some of the other factors. If you come in and you're like a forestry worker or something like that and you're loading stuff or lifting something heavy or using heavy machinery and you've been sinking some beers the night before and haven't had a lot of sleep, then that probably also plays a factor. So I hope now that workplace trainings also kind of address those, because I have a feeling that kind of training or education around that might be more effective than just like lift a box like this.
That's what I mean. It's the equivalent of almost of being a weekend warrior, of someone who like sits at a desk Monday to Friday, and then on the weekend it's like home renos, ripping up the garden, building a deck, doing all this like crazy intense work that their body's just not accustomed to. So I think some people that have those quite physical jobs, they would probably benefit from doing strength training, because if they're regularly lifting decent amount of weight, then doing those odd heavy lifts at work, your body would already be accustomed to that, and it wouldn't be like oh shit, I've got to lift this 20 kilo box at work today. If you're already lifting that or more regularly at the gym. And that was something that one of these studies touched on. They said they feel one of the causes of back pain could be more the avoidance of bending and twisting in the first place, because it's leaving people weak and deconditioned to tolerate these inevitable movements that they will face in day-to-day life or at work, by telling people to always like back straight, back flat, and
they're just not really accustomed
Yeah.
to that, because they may not be doing that anyway.
So I think the only times really, like the exception to that rule, the only time people should be temporarily avoiding particular movements is obviously if they are in pain or currently sensitized to that. Whereas I think often when people experience an injury from bending forward or from deadlifting, they equate the injury to that movement pattern and think, okay, shit, I'm never bending my back again, because when I bent forward or when I did that deadlift, bang, that's what injured my back. Like, I've just got to avoid that movement, and by avoiding that, it's generally what's gonna lead you to probably have another issue down the track.
Yeah, do you remember actually I messaged you, I think it was like over Christmas time, I'd hurt my back deadlifting. I was like, Shenae, reassure me that it's going to be okay, because I did feel like I'm never bending.
I can't do deadlifts ever again.
I'm never bending my back again. And I did get quite fearful of doing deadlifts for quite a while after that, but I did do what you said, and I got, after I was pain-free, I got back into doing them at lighter loads, and then, now I'm deadlifting 130. So
there we go.
Yeah.
It's just getting your body like tolerant to that stimulus or input again. So it's definitely, and again, starting obviously quite light body weight first and then gradually progressing from there, versus avoiding, there's not really any movement that we should be avoiding, because you're inevitably going to have to do that movement at some period of time, and it's better that your body's
maybe not a muscle up.
Maybe not that, but most movements you're going to experience. Well, I think the same. I think if someone was lifting overhead and then they felt shoulder pain, would you just like avoid ever lifting your arm above 90 degrees again? Like, no, because it's not functionally practical to be like, oh shit, now once I injured myself lifting overhead, like I'm never going to reach above 90 now. But I guess as well, people's pain experience with having back pain, it is intense and scary and debilitating, that you think, holy fuck, I never want to go through this again.
Yes,
If that means not deadlifting or not doing whatever, okay, I will do that. Whereas I guess with shoulder discomfort, it's usually probably not as intense, and therefore we're like, oh yeah, it feels all good, oh yeah, I can reach up now, I'm all good. Backs are quite just scary, I think, for people when they injure them, and so if it happened during a deadlift or something, it is often the first link that's made is like, oh no, it was my crap technique. But and touch on a couple of influences of pain, just so people understand why technique is generally one of a gazillion. So you've got individual factors, so someone's age, their genetics, family history of pain, obesity, psychological, which I would say are probably, some of the literature says that probably accounts for like 80% of
very
of most
significant.
injuries. So that's like your fear of pain, your perceived threat, unpleasant sensory or emotional experiences, negative beliefs and memories. So they definitely probably, I would say, for a lot of things, have the biggest piece of the puzzle. And yes, biomechanical factors, so like mechanical loading, poor motor control, physical overload, posture, regional strength, technique would also come into that as well. So that's
a big old math equation with a lot of parameters that can like vary hugely.
And then so that's 3. There's like 10 different categories.
Oh wow, okay, we're not even halfway through.
Nociceptive detection and processing, that's a big fancy word for just how your body processes pain. So things like central sensitization and peripheral sensitization, nociceptive input, all those, the chemical release. So that's all, again, how your body is reading the pain message. So the way your body reads pain can obviously affect how you experience it. Specific tissue injury and pathology, so if there is actual tissue damage or degeneration, arthritis, things like that can also obviously contribute. Behavioural and lifestyle, low physical activity, poor sleep, smoking, alcohol, diet. Contextual things like your access to a healthcare provider, timely and appropriate treatment, and the healthcare provider's beliefs. Obviously, if they tell you like, oh my god, this is the worst back issue I've seen before,
you're going to be freaked out.
You're never going to walk again. You'd be a bit stressed out. And social and work factors such as your beliefs, culture, spirituality, autonomy, social engagement, low income, and if you're on workers' comp. So all of those things influence someone's pain, not just your technique. So I think that's That's just why I get irritated by different influencers or personal trainers or coaches online saying like, boom, if you do this you'll get injured or you'll experience pain. Like
it's a bit more complex than that really, isn't it?
It is. It's very complex and there's a lot of things. So it's not saying that technique is not a factor. It definitely is a factor, but it's one of many, and it's likely when you hurt yourself deadlifting or squatting that your technique has probably played a pretty small part of why you've hurt yourself. It's probably, like I said, all of those things. If you're stressed out, if you're already feeling a bit achy that day or fatigued or tired,
Are there certain well-known things within movements that put unreasonable stress on joints and stuff and can contribute to things like arthritis or do increase your risk of injury? Are there certain examples of things like that? Like say if you're like jumping down off of a platform, or maybe in the way that someone might do a push-up or something like that, or squatting, deadlifting, that are well known to actually bring you into some sort of high risk zone. Because I would feel like there would be at probably an extreme point, either extreme in terms of load or extreme in terms of volume, where you might be introducing perhaps a risk of injury. But are there sort of well-known ones that...
I think we used to think that. Like, we used to think arthritis was... its nickname was like wear and tear. That like arthritis is from general wear and tear. So if like you're someone that's super active, you're going to get knee arthritis type thing, the more squatting you're doing or whatever. But over time we refer to something like arthritis as it is purely a degenerative issue, which just means like over time, just like we get grey hair and wrinkles on the outside, we get it on the inside, and we're going to get it at varying degrees, just like you and me will get grey hair at varying degrees. And
Speak for yourself, Shenae.
Not now, one day, Char, one day. And
I will get grey hair. I'll have lovely grey hair, I think.
Yeah, I think we both will. But it's like, again, to what degree, who knows? And again, there's going to be a lot of different, genetic factors that are going to influence like how much grey hair we get and at what rate, if we get heaps, if we get a few. So it's the same with degeneration. Like generally, I think it's like, 10% of 20-year-olds will already have some degeneration. And obviously that, as you get older, then it's like once you're 30, it's 20%, 30%. So 90% of 80-year-olds have degeneration. They've done studies on people that have been recreational runners throughout their whole life, and if they have a higher rate of arthritis, and most studies have found that their knees are in better condition than those that aren't running regularly. So I don't think there's any clear high quality evidence that like
there's sort of specific
if you're doing your push-ups always wrong, you're gonna have bad shoulders. Or I think that makes the body sound like we're a machine, whereas like our body does just adapt to the way we do things and usually just gets good at the way we do something. And then linking that in, I guess, to a little bit of injury prevention or avoidance, I think often that's another reason that we go crazy about technique, because it is on that wanting to avoid an injury. But as we've touched on, pain being very complex, we can't really avoid it. But the biggest thing in injury prevention is avoiding the twos, which is too heavy, too fast, too often, too far, or doing too much, too soon, after too little, for too long. So it's a bit of a tongue twister, but basically it's like, often people, that's their reason for injuring themselves. They're either going too heavy, they're going way too fast, they're doing it too often, or they're doing too much too soon after quite a long period of doing not so much. And specifically for runners, that was the biggest risk factor for injuries with runners. They looked at different risk factors, and the strongest one was for doing too much, like your mileage, increasing your mileage too much,
really,
too soon.
Really quickly.
So that would be my biggest thing for people is gradual graded exposure when you're either wanting to get into running or maybe start a new activity, is always just sort of start slow and steady, light, and progress from there.
Sweet.
And that pain is complex. Technique is important predominantly for efficiency, and if it starts to falter once you're fatiguing or maxing out, then that's not necessarily an issue, but you should be aware of it and think, okay, my technique's starting to go on this 100 kilo deadlift, then maybe that's me for today. Maybe I shouldn't push for 120 as I planned.
And don't feel too alarmed if you watch video back of you doing a deadlift and you see a bit of
rounding, or if your video of your squats, your knees sort of go in, or
you've got a butt wink, or someone tells you you've got a butt wink or something, and you're like, oh no, no more squats for me till I fix that somehow.
Yeah.
And that you covered a couple of ways that you can sort of
address it if need to. It doesn't mean like if it was giving someone issues, either if it was uncomfortable for them or they were finding that they couldn't get out of their squat or they couldn't progress their weight, then definitely worth looking at. Like I think I've touched on this before, advice I got on squatting when going to CrossFit. For so long I'd been used to just a body pump squat, which was like sitting your hips back.
Yeah.
And so always just sitting back to like parallel. And when I was doing CrossFit, I was always struggling to get deeper. And one of my coaches came over and he's just like, at first it was a bit like, oh, maybe you've got really stiff ankles, because he's like, you're not getting any like forward translation of your knees. But then he just said, he's like, just try driving your knees forward. Like instead of thinking of sitting back, think about driving your knees forward and out. And so just for me, just doing that and thinking about that, like boom.
Change the movement pattern.
Change my movement pattern and my depth and everything. And I was like, oh, it was just that one simple cue. But like it wasn't a joint limitation or anything. It was just the way I had been doing it for so long.
Yeah, you're sort of, I think they call it a motor plan.
Yeah.
Like your motor plan of what the movement's going to look like. We actually do have one of those. Our central nervous system comes up with them and we then execute it.
Yeah.
And so that's where those cues can come in and can be helpful, is trying to shift that motor plan if you want to do the movement in a different way.
Yeah. So yeah, that's all I have on technique.
Awesome.
If you've got any more questions, or otherwise, if people have any more questions, they can reach out.
Yeah, where can they find you, Shenae?
At Health Coach Shenae on Instagram.
I mean, and if you want to talk to me, I'm on Charlie J. Connell on Instagram. That's cool.
Hit us up or give us your feedback as well. We love to hear feedback on either topics you guys want to hear more about or what you are enjoying.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of things coming up for our next episodes. It's going into running season, and I am doing the Coast to Coast this year. So I want to do, I'm doing a part of the Coast to Coast this year. I'm not doing the whole thing. I'm doing it as part of a team. So I think it would be helpful for me to review things about fueling for endurance exercise, going into summer too. I mean, kind of, right?
Maybe spring.
Yeah, spring. So what happens to our bodies in the heat? Those are the topics that I've got in mind for coming up. But if people have others, then
I was going to get one of my physio friends in to discuss running as well, running and sort of more so running related injuries, and again how we can avoid that, which I think I've already, spoiler alert, told you a little bit about how to avoid injuries, but
awesome.
Look forward to it.
Sweet.
Bye.
See ya.